Okay, we're going to start Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, chapter 21. Before I do so, I want to address the question that, Bill, you asked last week. So the question was, if a person dozes off or lets his mind wander in the middle of the Amidah, and he doesn't remember where he's holding. So then when you catch yourself, do you go back to, basically there's two choices. One option would be, let's err on the side of caution to not say any bracha in vain. If I've already said the bracha and I repeat it, then I'll be saying a bracha in vain. And therefore, if I'm not sure if I'm up to bracha 3, 4, 5, or 6, I should go to 6 and not risk repeating 3, 4, 5. Or you could say, no, I don't want to risk not saying an entire Amidah. And so I'm going to go back to 3. And indeed, I have a risk that maybe I'm going to end up saying 3, 4, 5 twice. But better that risk than the risk of omitting a bracha, and so better go back to 3. The consensus of the poskim, we already mentioned last week as we looked it up, that the consensus of the poskim is certainly more in favor of going back to any bracha concerning which you have a doubt. Yeah, so. Actually, the mashal I gave is not a good one because I said 3, 4, 5. But if 3 is part of the question, then you would have to go back to the beginning of the Amidah. Because as we've said a number of times, brachas 1, 2, and 3 are one unit. And so you never go back to the third bracha. If you go back to the third bracha, then you have to go back to the beginning. Right? For example, in the 10 days of repentance, if you didn't say Hamelach HaKadosh, instead you said Hakel HaKadosh, then you go back to the beginning of the Amidah. Don't go back to that blessing, which is the third blessing. You go back to the beginning of the Amidah. But that's how you don't know if you're up to blessing 5 or 6 or 7. So the consensus of the poskim is you would go back to bracha 5. And one very prominent source for this is basically actually in the Gemara, in the Talmud Yerushalmi. This is in the Jerusalem Talmud in Tractate Brachas, chapter 2, at the very end of Halacha 4. And the Yerushalmi itself is, as usual, is often not so clear, but the way the Pnei Moshe, who's the commentary here on the side, and if you can make out the Rashi script, I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see it even better. He says, "V'chein hadin b'tfilah." The same would apply to prayer, to the Amidah. Imatzu atzim b'shemei tfilah. One second, sorry, wrong one. One second. I thought I saw it a little bit more explicit here. Yeah, I think the reference that they're bringing is here that he says that if you find yourself in the middle of the bracha of Shemei Tefillah, if you find yourself in the middle of that bracha, then you can assume that you indeed set everything up until then, and therefore you don't have to go back. And the implication being that if you don't know where you're up to, you don't find yourself in the middle of any specific bracha. You just don't remember where you're up to. So then you do go back. And there's, of course, other sources as well. I'll just share, though, an interesting thing, because obviously if this is for us, if we would have some reference from the Alter Rebbe in this regard, then that would be machriya for us, that we would pass like the Alter Rebbe. And so some attempt to bring a proof from the Alter Rebbe in the opposite direction, that you go to the bracha that you are up to right now. So in other words, that you go to the bracha that you for sure have not said. So again, you're not sure if you're up to bracha. You know for sure you said brachas 1, 2, 3, 4. You're not sure if you said 5 and 6, and you're sure you have not said 7. So are you going back to 5 or are you going back to 7? So here, in the laws of prayer in the 10 days of repentance, the Alter Rebbe says like this. What happens if a person what happens if a person has a suffix? Okay, let's read this inside. Similar law applies. Similar law applies with regard to correcting oneself if one said Melech Oyev Tzedakah Mishpat during those 10 days instead of saying Hamelech HaMishpat. However, if one became aware of his error after this time, sorry, we have to go back a little bit. Okay. Let's read from the beginning, and just to clarify it, it'll be throughout the year. One concludes the third blessing of Shemona Esrei with the words Hakel HaKadosh, the 11th blessing with the words Melech Oyev Tzedakah Mishpat. During 10 days of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, one must say Hamelech HaKadosh in the third bracha and Hamelech HaMishpat in the 11th bracha. For on these days, the Holy One, blessed be He, reveals His sovereignty by standing in judgment over the entire world. Now, if a person made a mistake and says Hakel HaKadosh, or if he's uncertain if he said Hakel HaKadosh or Hamelech HaKadosh, then if he became of his error only after he ended the third blessing, and needless to say, if he already began the fourth blessing, and the time that it takes for a student to greet his teacher has already passed. That's the amount of time it takes to say Shalom Aleichem Rabbi, a second or two. Then he must recommence Shemona Esrei. In other words, he has to go back to where he was up to, but because it's one of the first three brachas, so he has to go back all the way to the beginning. He cannot simply repeat the third blessing because the first three blessings are one unit. If he became of his error immediately before this time span has passed, he should correct himself and say Hamelech HaKadosh, and there is no need to recommence Shemona Esrei. Now, then he continues. Similar law applies with regard to correcting oneself if he said Hamelech Tzedakah Mishpat instead of Hamelech HaMishpat. However, if one became of this error after the time span, he need not return to the beginning of the Amidah, because by saying the former phrase, he also mentioned God's kinker, right? Hamelech Oyev Tzedakah Mishpat is not as bad a mistake as saying Hakel HaKadosh. Because you say Hakel HaKadosh, you haven't mentioned God's sovereignty at all. You've said the Holy God. You haven't said anything about King. Whereas when you say Melech Oyev Tzedakah Mishpat, the King of justice and law, yeah, how does he translate it? King who loves charity and justice. So you've said King, so it's not so bad. And therefore, if you said the wrong thing, if you remembered right away within that little small time frame, you correct yourself. But if you didn't remember right away, then just continue. Don't worry about it. You don't need to repeat the Amidah. However, somehow some authorities maintain that if one became aware of his error before completing the Amidah, then you should return to the 11th blessing of Hashiva. And according to this opinion, if he became aware after completing the Shemona Esrei, he should recommence the Shemona Esrei according to the principle explained above, right? So the second opinion says, no, there's no difference. Hamelech Oyev Tzedakah Mishpat, you also have to repeat the Amidah for. So what are we going to do? So therefore, so the halacha, he says, is, with regard to the actual ruling, we follow the principle that whenever there is doubt as to whether or not a blessing should be recited, we rule leniently, i.e. the blessing should not be recited. Mm-hmm. Therefore, if one became of his error before completing his blessing, he should not require to return. However, after completing, it's advisable to repeat it as a voluntary prayer. Okay, so basically we have here a machlokas. If somebody says Melech Oyev Tzedakah Mishpat, and he continues, he's in the middle now of the 14th bracha, and then he realizes. So does he go back or not? So in doubt. So what is the Alter Rebbe Paskin? We say Safek brachas lahakel, right? It's not just Alter Rebbe. This is also this is the common practice certainly amongst Ashkenazim. I believe this is the common ruling, right? So here you have a person who's in doubt as to whether or not he needs to say a specific bracha of the Amidah, and we tell him don't say it. So how does that fit with what we're claiming over here? That a person, if he doesn't know whether or not he said the fifth or the sixth bracha of the Amidah, that he should repeat it. So there is a very important distinction in halacha. We use the word suffix, doubt, but there is a very important distinction between two different types of doubt. There's what's called a suffix in halacha, and there's a suffix in metzias. Suffix in halacha means I don't know what the law is. One opinion says I do have to repeat the Amidah. Another opinion says In this case, I don't need to repeat the Amidah, and so Safek Brachas Lahaka. That's what's going on over there. One opinion says Hamelech HaMishpat is an indispensable part of the Amidah, right? Then you have a Safek Matzias. This is very relevant. It comes up in the laws of Kashrus also. Then you have a Safek Matzias. Safek Matzias means I don't know the reality of what transpired. Did I say bracha 5 and 6? Did I not say bracha 5 or 6? There, the doubt is not a doubt because there's two opinions and I don't know which of those opinions is correct. The doubt is I don't know what happened, right? This is a very important distinction which comes up in all areas of halacha. For example, you have a shaila in your kitchen. So sometimes there will be a certain amount of milk in the chicken soup, whatever it is, right? So there could be, okay, one opinion says it's okay, one opinion says it's not okay. That's a case of doubt, right? Or you could have a doubt that I don't know if the milk fell into the chicken soup or not, right? Those are two distinct different types of doubts which halacha treats differently. So this halacha of Hamelech HaMishpat tells us that if you have a doubt in the halacha regarding repeating the Amidah, then you don't repeat it. But one could still maintain, based on this Yerushalmi, that but if a person has a doubt whether or not he said a specific bracha, which is not a doubt in halacha, it's a doubt in reality of this world, then he would repeat it. Now, you could then say, well, if that's the case, since there are some opinions that if you're in doubt whether or not you said a bracha, you do not repeat the Amidah, so you do not repeat those blessings, so then it comes back to a Safek in halacha, and then it's Safek Brachas Lahaka. Nevertheless, I guess it depends who the two opinions are. These two opinions that are quoted in the Paskim, or these are two opinions of two rabbis who are, contemporary rabbis. The one says, I think this way. The one says, I think that way. Again, in practice, the Paskim that I saw are all leaning towards the opinion that one does repeat those brachas. Anyway, that's just to address your question from last week. And
okay.
I'm going to start chapter 22, which is the laws of Tachnun. So we have here a little preface. Okay, let's read the preface. Concerning his many prayers, Moses said of himself, that I sat on the mountain for 40 days. And then he says, then he says that I stood on the mountain, again, for 40 days. And then he says, that I prostrated myself before Hashem. So Moshe describes three different positions of prayer. Standing, sitting, and prostrating. So therefore, Jews sympathetically also assume these three positions during prayer: by sitting before the Amidah, standing during the Amidah, and nefilas apayim, literally falling on the face, which is at least reminiscent of prostrating oneself after the Amidah. This is called Tachnun. Originally, nefilas apayim was performed by entirely prostrating one's body upon the ground, praying and pleading for one's needs. However, with the destruction of the temple, this practice was discouraged. Also, the Talmud states that only a righteous person comparable to Yeshua, who is assured of a prayer, of a response to prayer in this manner, may assume this position in prayer. I assume the reference to Yeshua's prayer is, sorry? Yes. I assume it's talking about when he stopped the sun. I'm not sure. Right? Anyway. Therefore, the custom has become to inform the time only perfunctorily by sitting and tilting one's head downward, and the custom is to lead on one's arm. Now, he writes here that that you sit, that the three positions are sitting before the Amidah, standing during the Amidah, and prostrating oneself after the Amidah. I believe that there's also this, the custom is that after you prostrate yourself, not on Monday and Thursday, but the rest of my mincha and even on Shacharis during the other days of the week, we say at least a few lines sitting down, the Avinu Malkeinu, right? So that my understanding was always that that's the part that represents the sitting down part of prayer. It's interesting that even though the Amida is the integral part of prayer, but in the construct of prayer, halachically, Nefilas Apayim, Tachnun, after the prayer is really like a part of prayer. It's very evident if you look in the way the Rambam describes Tachnun, he describes it as being sort of after the prayer, but part of the prayer. And also Al Pi Kabbalah, you have in Tanya, we had a few weeks ago in Tanya, the Alter Rebbe describes how Al Pi Kabbalah Nefilas Apayim is an integral follow-up of the Amida. Okay. So upon completing the Amida, Tachnun is said with Nefilas Apayim. Idle talk is prohibited in between Shemina Esra and Tachnun. And again, because Tachnun is supposed to be sort of juxtaposed, it's a part of the prayer. During the morning prayers, during Shachas, when tefillin are worn in the hand, Tachnun is said leaning on the right hand out of respect for the tefillin. But at the mincha prayer, you say it on the left hand. The idea is that you don't want to lean on the tefillin. Okay, right? So a left-handed person always would lean on his left hand. Yeah, that's one of the things that doesn't change from righty to lefty. No, that's not true. That's not true. Sorry. No, that means on a regular. When somebody is not wearing tefillin, you lean on the left hand. When somebody is wearing tefillin, he leans on his right hand. What about? Yeah, and that's the same for a lefty. In other words, somebody who's left-handed also leans on his left hand, even though that's a strong hand. Right? Let's talk about for mincha, right? Now, for shachris, if you're wearing tefillin on your left hand, then you switch to doing on your right hand. Whereas a lefty doesn't have to switch because his tefillin are in his right hand. So a lefty is always going to lean on his left hand. A righty will lean on his left hand during mincha and on his right hand during shachris. It's also, maybe he's going to say it, but we're careful not to lean directly on your hand. So during shachris, you have a sleeve. If not, you get your talis, or people use a tefillin strap. But you should also to be careful by mincha. If you're wearing short sleeves, you don't lean directly on your arm. And so if you don't have long sleeves, I don't know, you take a tissue or whatever it is, or something, you don't lean directly on your arm. Okay. Nefilas Apayim is preferably done when sitting, but when necessary, it may be done while standing. After Tachnun, V'anachnu lo neda is said, it's preferable that it be said while sitting, and afterwards you should stand and say manase. So you stand up in the middle of those words, V'anachnu lo neda manase. Nefilas Apayim is done only in a place where a Sefer Torah is present. If there's no Sefer Torah, even though there are other sacred books there, Nefilas Apayim is not done. Instead, the psalm is said without Nefilas Apayim. So you just sit down and say the psalm, but you don't actually lean on your arm. You don't bow your head down. When praying in the synagogue vestibule and the door to the synagogue is open, so if you're outside in the hallway, the door is open, then it's considered as if the Sefer Torah is there, and you may indeed say, do it. Okay, he brings here that some poskim say that in Yerushalayim you could lean Nefilas Apayim even in absence of a Sefer Torah. He brings here that some poskim are lenient and do allow Nefilas Apayim even in absence of a Sefer Torah if there are other holy books there. Okay. When praying in the house of an ovel or in the house of the deceased, even if there's no mourner present, Tachnun is not said during the 7 days of mourning. even at mincha on the 7th of the 7th day. Even at mincha of the 7th day. It's very interesting. It's not common to know that because usually we don't do mincha in the Avel's house anymore on the 7th day because he gets up in the morning. But if for whatever reason, that's what he's saying here. If for whatever reason you were davening mincha in the Avel's house, or either in the house of the mourner or in the house of the deceased at the mincha of the 7th day, so even though he's finished his mourning, but you still wouldn't say tachnon. It's customary that even if the mourners return home, no, this is a mistake. It is customary that even if they return home, they don't say tachnon. They're referring to the people who are not mourners, right? If I go and daven in the house of a mourner, then when I go home, I still say I don't have to compensate the tachnon that I missed.
Whereas a mourner,
because I daven there. Seems to me to be a mistake. It's not if the mourners returned home. It's if they returned home, and they refers not to the mourners but to the other people. The mourners obviously don't say tachnon because you don't say tachnon in shiva. The chiddush, the novelty is that even if a non-avel davens in the house of an avel, he doesn't have to compensate the tachnon that he missed when he got home. The mourner is present in the shul during the prayers. The congregation is not drawn after him, and they do say tachnon, whereas the mourner does not. So if somebody does not have a minyan in his house and he's in the middle of shiva and comes to daven in shul, so then the rest of the congregation does say tachnon and he does not. He brings here from the Gesher HaChaim that's just if the mourner is standing in as one of the people praying in the shul. But if he's davening for the Amid in the shul, then everybody does follow his lead and omit tachnon. Gesher HaChaim is one of the classical svarim on the halachas of Avelos of mourning. Similarly, he says if it's in the shul, and even if he's not davening for the Amid, but everybody gathered in his honor, let's say it's not a shul that has a minyan every day, but they made a special minyan for him, but for whatever reason, the minyan wasn't in his house, it was made in the shul. So then he says in such a case, you would omit tachnon. Okay. Tachnon is omitted in a synagogue where a circumcision will take place, or if the father of the child to be circumcised, or the sandik who hold the child at the circumcision, or the moel is praying there. Even if the circumcision will take place at another location. If the mincha prayer is said in the child's home before the bris, feast, or during the feast, tachnon is also omitted. The mincha prayer said after the benching, Birchas Hamazon, then tachnon is said. If the father of the child, the one holding the child, the mother, then also tachnon, even after Birchas Hamazon, because it is their holiday. Okay, so let's just summarize here. There are three people who are considered Bali Bris. They are celebrating. The father of the child, the moel, and the sandik. Now, if the bris, when it's before the bris, so let's say shachris, it's before the bris. So if one of those three people are present for shachris, then tachnon is omitted by everybody in the minyan. Similarly, if none of those people are present, but the bris is going to take this shul. Later today, there's going to be a bris in this shul. So that room sort of takes on the celebratory quality, and tachnon is omitted. What about, first you got to make a bris, then we can celebrate. Okay. What about by mincha? So mincha, he says, well, it depends. If it's, so a second. He says, those three people, the Bali Abris, the father, the child, the moel, and the sandik, they don't say tachnon by mincha at all. Even if the bris was in the morning and the davening mincha obviously much later in the day, those three individuals don't say tachanun for the whole day. The rest of the tzibur, if they're davening mincha before the bris, in the shul where the bris is, or in the home where the bris is, or even if they're davening mincha after the actual circumcision, but during the feast of the bris, during the meal, before they bench, so then tachanun is omitted. But if after benching they say let's daven mincha, after benching, then it's no longer considered a yom tov strong enough that everybody omits tachanun. It's only, but it is considered a yom tov just for those individuals to omit it. Similarly, tachanun is omitted in a synagogue where a chassan is present during all 7 days of feasting, provided that the groom was a bachur or the bride was a psul. In other words, one of the two has to be a first marriage. But if a widow married a widow, or for that matter, a divorcee, if one of them is, if both of them are a second marriage, so they're both either widowed or divorced, there are only 3 days after which tachanun is resumed. On the day of the marriage ceremony, tachanun is said at shachris, but not at the mincha preceding the ceremony. It is not said. The common practice is not like this. The common practice is that we omit tachanun even by shachris. On the day of the wedding, he is already considered a chassan, and we omit tachanun that morning as well. 1 second. Yeah. Okay, I think we'll pause over here. Any questions?
How many days after?
He said 7 days, and he says 3 days if it's
3 days.
3 days if it's a second marriage. Okay. Good night.
Thank you.